Hello, welcome to this video for Comp 6259 Advanced Game Design at the University of Southampton. My name's David Millard and I'm one of the lecturers on the course. In this second video we're going to be looking at one of the mechanics of mixed reality or locative games that is particularly important, and that mechanic is navigation. So when we've looked at interactive digital narratives in the past, we've seen that there are many different types of navigational structures. Things like time caves, for example, where the story branches endlessly, or gauntlets, which is essentially a linear path through a narrative, but with excursions off to the side, returning to the main path later in the story. Well, we can see the same sort of navigational structures appear in locative games, but here they're not just navigational structures around narrative, but also around physical location. Back in 2013, I wrote a paper with some colleagues here at the university that described some of these key structures. We broke it down into three core types. The first is a canyon. So this is a linear narrative represented as a sequence of nodes which are presented in a particular order. So you might think of this as representing a kind of guided tour where the system takes you on a linear journey through a particular location. The second was a delta. So this is a bit like a canyon, but here at various points you're given choices, and the structure therefore branches and takes you in different directions according to the choices that you make. The delta is very similar to the sort of time cave structure that we see in normal interactive digital narrative. But again, here very often the choices are not made by clicking on links, but by physically walking to different locations. The last structure is a plane. So this is a sequence of nodes or information points that you can visit in any order. So you can wander around and trigger these when you're in the appropriate location. So if a canyon is more suited to a tour guide, something like a plane would be more suited to an information system where you would wander around a particular place and say, well, tell me more about where I am here. The key thing about the canyons, deltas and planes model is it says that these three basic structures can be plugged together in different ways to create different types of sophisticated experiences. So let's have a look at the three examples I used in the first video and see what they look like in terms of canyons, deltas and planes. The first example was Chawton House. If you remember, this was an experience for children set in the grounds of a manor house. The children arrive on site and they experience a sequence of setup cards that take them into the manor house gardens and give them instructions about what they need to do in the game. This is then followed by a period of open exploration, and then after a certain amount of time it turns into a series of reflective activities that the children have to do. Typically these are off device, so things like acting out a particular scene or writing a story or a poem in their notebooks. We can conceptualize Chawton as a canyon, that's the setup cards, leading to a plane, that's the open exploration stage, and then after a time limit has been reached, it leads to a second canyon that returns them to the beginning, or returns them to a place within the Manor House Gardens where they can do these sequence of activities. Our second example was Riot, which was a kind of audio virtual play that unfolded in Queen Square in Bristol. Now in Queen Square, the square was divided up into different zones, and as you walked around those zones it would activate different bits of audio, and then over time the drama would progress. In terms of canyons, deltas and planes, we can see this as a sequence of planes. So each plane represents a different time period, and you can move around the square and you can listen to what's happening to the characters in that particular time period, and then after a certain amount of physical time has passed, that plane gets swapped out for another plane which replaces the one using the same locations, and the story progresses. And this is what gives you the sense of this kind of virtual play unfolding around you. Our third example was Viking Ghost Hunt, where you hunt for ghosts on the streets of Dublin, a sort of a branching adventure game. So you can think about Viking Ghost Hunt as a plane where every single one of the elements in that plane is the start of a delta, start of a particular ghost story. So in the graph on the right we have 9 ghosts in the plane, and when I move to the place where one of those ghosts is, it activates the delta below. But every single one of those would have its own delta, and that delta represents the interactive experience with the ghost itself, the conversation with the ghost, and ultimately the outcome of that particular story. I returned to mixed reality games in 2016 through the Story Places project, So in the Story Places project, we wanted to explore the idea of locative games, in particular narrative games, and we were very much inspired by the canyons, deltas and plains model. So we built a Story Places web app that was deliberately minimal. It only has text and basic graphics. It uses GPS for moving around. And then we worked with many different types of authors to explore how they might use that to tell different sorts of interactive stories that were positioned in physical environments. In the project, we had a number of different case studies, but the first was set in Southampton Old Town, and we worked with 40 different creative writing students to try and think what they would build using this type of system. What was interesting is that when we went over their stories afterwards and analysed in terms of the canyons, deltas and plains model, what we discovered was that the vast number of students had either written a very linear experience, so effectively a canyon, or they'd written a very open experience where you could wander around and sort of experience bits and it didn't matter what order they were in, kind of flash fiction or flash poetry, so canyons and plains. We felt very few people exploring deltas on their own, and also very few combinations. We did have a few canyons, effectively people replicating a sort of broomstick model where you would go on a linear tour and then make some choices towards the end as to how the story would finish. And we also had some canyons and plains, so linear stories that had open sections. But what this analysis shows you is that there's a lot of untapped potential in the navigational structures of mixed reality games. And in fact, the vast majority of games that appear in the literature have similarly simple structures. Despite the importance of navigation and movement, they're still not something that is explored particularly well in today's mixed reality games and systems. In the next video, we're going to build on this idea and look at the poetics of mixed reality games. How do you design them so they are well integrated with the environments in which they are experienced? How do you create a design for a game which has both a virtual and a physical element? See you in the next video.